St. Irvins, the sort of village that only ever seemed to appear in watercolor postcards and nostalgic war memoirs, was not known for excitement. It lay tucked between the gentle hills of Dorset, a cluster of cottages with slate roofs and ivy-covered porches, where life moved at the pace of butter setting in the pantry. Children rode bicycles with wicker baskets, and old men argued over cribbage scores at the King's Plome, a village where time and mischief appeared to have fallen asleep. On the Tuesday in question, the weather was especially fine. Sunlight dappled through the leaves, and the smell of honeysuckle mixed with the distant sound of sheep. Miss Jane Marple had just set down her embroidery and was enjoying a pot of Earl Grey in the parlor of Rose Cottage when the telephone rang with an urgency out of keeping with the time of day. It was Mrs. Dulcie Pargeter, the vicar's wife and chief disseminator of village news, who wasted no time in breathless relay. "Jane, you'll never guess what's happened at Long Brooms. Alice Withers says a man turned up this afternoon, banged on the door, and then collapsed on the step, dead before he hit the mat." Miss Marple blinked. "Goodness, whose door was it exactly?" "Why, the Carraways. Long Brooms, you know. No one's lived there in years, not since Colonel Carraway passed and Lydia moved to Devon. But young Charles came back last month, very quiet, very reclusive. And now this, a man who no one recognizes, arriving like he belonged. Alice says he even had a key." A silence hummed through the line. Miss Marple's teacup remained half-raised. "How extraordinary," she murmured. Long Broom stood at the edge of the village, a stately red-brick house half swallowed by overgrown yew and a tall iron gate that groaned like a reluctant confession. Charles Carraway, the late Colonel's only son, had been something of a ghost since returning. A former solicitor with some vague disgrace behind him, Miss Hartnell thought it was drink, while Mr. Featherstone swore it was a client's suicide. Charles kept to himself, rarely seen except at the post office or chemist, head bowed like a man afraid of recognition. It was Mrs. Tilling who had seen the stranger first, a sturdy widow with little patience and excellent eyesight. She had been trimming her roses across the lane when a dark-suited figure came up the road. He moved like he had purpose, paused at the gate, then, without a glance at the bell or letterbox, pulled a key from his coat and let himself in. He walked like a man who lived there, she told the gathering at the shop later. Didn't look left or right, went straight up the path, knocked 3 times, firm as you like, and then dropped like a felled tree. No twitching, stone cold, they say, by the time Charles opened the door. "Heart attack," opined Mr. Bodkin, tapping his nose sagely. "Or poison. Mark me." Charles looked like a corpse himself when he opened the door, added Miss Crampton. "White as salt and twice as shaken." Within the hour, Inspector Cray of the County Constabulary had arrived, a tall man with a mustache better suited to diplomacy than detection. He spoke to Charles Carraway in low tones, examined the stranger's wallet, which contained nothing but a blank card and a pressed violet, and called for the coroner. But even in official circles, the whisper had already taken root. Why would a man have a key to a house that wasn't his? By evening, the village was abuzz, though the facts remained few. The deceased was in his late 50s, well-dressed but not wealthy, with no identification save for the pressed violet, something the younger ladies found romantic and the older ones suspicious. He had no luggage, no note, no visible wounds. Charles Carraway, according to Inspector Cray, claimed never to have seen him before. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had walked to the post office with no particular purpose except to send a postcard to her nephew Raymond in London, ostensibly about the roses blooming late this year. She spoke to no one of the stranger. She merely observed that Charles Carraway had not returned to his house, and that Mrs. Tilling's hand shook slightly as she counted out her change. It was Miss Marple's habit to collect the tiniest gestures, the words not said, and the tremors that passed unnoticed by those younger and louder. She noted that no one asked what had happened to the key, and that Alice Withers, who had seen the whole thing from her upper window, said nothing about the knock itself. That night, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and stood at her bedroom window. Somewhere in the distance, Longbroom stood silent, its lights out, its doors locked, or perhaps not. A stranger had arrived. A man who knocked at his own door and died before it opened. Such things did not happen in Saint-Hervance. Not unless someone wanted them to. The morning after the incident at Longbrooms broke with a pale, damp drizzle, as though the sky itself wished to wash away the disquiet of the previous day. But if the heavens had any hope of silencing the village's chatter, they were sorely mistaken. From the baker's queue to the aisles of Grover's general store, the matter of the stranger's death had woven itself into every sentence, every cup of tea, every passing glance. Miss Marple, ever punctual, arrived at St. Mary Mead's Church for the Wednesday Flower Committee meeting 10 minutes early. She did not, as she usually would, begin arranging the vases of sweet peas brought in from her garden. Instead, she quietly listened as Mrs. Tilling, Mrs. Hartnell, and a rather excitable Miss Crampton rehashed their understanding of the situation with increasing fervor. "You mark my words," said Mrs. Hartnell, pulling off her wet gloves. "There's something in that Carraway house that doesn't belong to Charles. That man came for a reason. You don't just die on someone's doorstep without a purpose." Miss Crampton leaned in, eyes wide behind her spectacles. But why the knock? If he had a key, why not let himself in and whatever he meant to do? Why knock? "Well, perhaps," said Miss Marple mildly. "He expected someone else to open the door. Someone he believed still lived there." The others turned to her. "But Longbrooms has been empty for years," said Mrs. Tilling. "Only Charles has returned, and he only came back last month." "Yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "And yet this man behaved with the certainty of one coming home. A key in his pocket, no hesitation at the gate. It suggests familiarity or memory. They considered this the way a cat might consider an unopened tin." "Do you think Charles knew him?" asked Miss Crampton at last. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple gently. "Or perhaps he did not want to." Later that morning, Inspector Cray called on Miss Marple under the polite pretense of seeking advice on parish records. It was not the first time the inspector had visited Rose Cottage. He had long ago come to accept, albeit without ever quite saying so aloud, that Miss Marple's grasp of village dynamics was more reliable than any official file. "I thought you might have heard something," he said, perching stiffly on her floral armchair. "There's nothing to identify the fellow. No fingerprints on record, no suitcase. The pressed violet is peculiar, but it tells us nothing concrete." Miss Marple poured tea. "And Mr. Carraway, what does he say?" Cray exhaled through his nose. "Claims total ignorance. Said he opened the door expecting a delivery and nearly tripped over the man. I don't think he's lying exactly, but he's not being entirely forthcoming either. There was a moment, just a flicker, when he saw the body. That made me wonder." "What sort of flicker?" "Recognition, or guilt, or perhaps just fear. I'm not trained in all that psychology business, but the man looked haunted, and yet insists he's never seen him." Miss Marple stirred her tea without sipping. "Tell me, did you notice if the key was old or new?" Cray raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because Longbrooms had its locks changed after Lydia Carraway moved out. I remember it well. There was a dispute about a borrowed key that never came back, and the solicitor, Wilkinson's, I believe, recommended they replace the lot. If the man had a key, and it still fit, then either it was Charles who had the locks changed, and changed them back, or someone gave this stranger a key from after the change." Cray sat back. "That's a rather interesting point." Miss Marple gave him a thin smile. "You might look into who had access to the locksmith's orders at the time. Someone might have had a duplicate made." That afternoon, the coroner's report came in with no new revelations. The man had died of cardiac arrest. No drugs, no trauma, no signs of foul play, though that, in Miss Marple's experience, was never as final a verdict as it sounded. By evening the weather had cleared, and a mist hovered along the hedgerows. Miss Marple took her customary walk, which, without overt intention, curved past long brooms. She stopped briefly by the gate, which was now chained shut, and allowed her gaze to settle on the windows. The curtains were drawn, but there was a light on in the study. Charles was home. On impulse, she retraced her steps and turned down a side path to the vicarage, where she found the Reverend Pargeter and his wife seated on the lawn with tea and a tray of currant scones. The vicar greeted her warmly, and Miss Marple, after politely declining a second cup, inquired if either of them had known the late Colonel Carraway's friends. "Not well," said the vicar. "The colonel was already ailing when we moved here. Lydia, of course, was quite active in the church, but Charles was in London by then." Mrs. Pargeter added, "There was some talk at the time about an affair, you know. Not Charles, but the colonel, a woman from the north, I think, caused no end of trouble in the household. Lydia took the boy and went to her sister's for months. When she came back, everything was very formal, very cold." Miss Marple nodded. "And no name for this woman. No one knew it, or if they did, they were terribly discreet." Miss Marple returned home as dusk settled, the air now holding the scent of turned earth and rain-washed leaves. The mention of an affair, an unexplained key, and a man dead on a doorstep, it all began to take a certain shape in her mind, though nothing yet solid. That night she sat up reading an old parish newsletter, eyes lingering on a short piece about a charity fundraiser held at Longbroom 6 years ago. The name of the florist struck her, Miss Helena Vaughan of Leeds. A guest, perhaps, or someone hired for the arrangements. It seemed out of place. Why bring someone in from so far away? The next morning, the village had something new to discuss. Young Dennis Plum, the paper boy, had told his mother that he'd seen a woman outside Longbrooms late the night before, standing behind the hedgerow, almost hidden in the shadows. He'd assumed it was Charles at first, but then saw the figure was too small, the coat too long. "Waiting," he said, like she was watching. Word spread quickly. A woman seen lurking, a dead man with no name, and a key that fit a house no stranger should possess. Miss Marple took her toast at the kitchen window, her cat purring at her feet. There was something nearly formed now, a pattern that spoke of love long denied, secrets shelved like books too painful to reread, and someone, perhaps more than one, who had waited too long to exact their price. The dead man had returned for something, or someone, but he had knocked on a door that did not wish to be opened, and someone in St. Irvins had made sure it never would be. Miss Marple spent the next morning engaged in seemingly mundane activities, sorting linens, drafting a letter to her niece, and attending to a minor but stubborn mildew problem on her garden bench. But her mind, quietly active behind the gentle rhythm of her hands, was busy fitting together pieces of a puzzle that had not yet declared its picture. The presence of a mysterious woman near Longbrooms had sent the village into a flutter of conjecture. Speculation ranged wildly, from a jilted lover come to make trouble to a clairvoyant summoned by Charles to chase away ghosts, though no one seemed to agree on whose ghosts. As usual, very little of the gossip was useful in itself, but Miss Marple knew from long habit that the tone of speculation often reflected the unspoken anxieties of a place more than any real clue. After luncheon, she took it upon herself to call on young Dennis Plum under the pretense of returning a library book. His mother, a watchful woman with a firm mouth, let her in with barely concealed suspicion, until Miss Marple complimented her hydrangeas, which softened her considerably. Dennis was fetched, and Miss Marple, settling herself in the parlor with a cup of overstewed tea, soon had the boy recounting his sighting in more detail. "She wasn't just standing, miss. he said. She was sort of poised, you know. Not like a beggar or someone lost. Like she knew she was being watched but didn't care. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but intent. Did you see her face, dear? Dennis shook his head. Number she had a scarf on. Real thick, even though it's warm, and gloves too. Gloves? Miss Marple echoed, filing that detail carefully. Yes, ma'am, black ones. She held them close, like she didn't want anyone to see her hands. And how tall would you say she was? He tilted his head. Bit taller than Mum, maybe, but not big. Sort of proper, like a lady. Back at Rose Cottage, Miss Marple pulled her small address book from the bureau drawer and thumbed through it until she found the number for Helena Vaughan. She hesitated only a moment before dialing, unsure whether the florist still worked at the same shop in Leeds. To her surprise, the voice that answered confirmed that Miss Vaughan still owned the business. Yes, came the woman's voice, warm but guarded when asked about long brooms. I did arrangements for a fundraiser there. Years ago, Colonel Carraway's wife was a client of mine, briefly. Do you recall anything unusual about the family? A pause. Not exactly. But I remember a man who came down from London during that visit. Not the Colonel. A visitor, tall, handsome, with a cane. I assumed he was family. He and Mrs. Carraway had words while I was placing the urns. I didn't catch much, but it was quite tense. Miss Marple thanked her and ended the call with a gentle click. A visitor from London, handsome, with a cane. Possibly the same man who had arrived last week only to die on Charles's doorstep. If it was him, then he had history with the Carraway family. But who was he, and why had he waited so many years to return? She took her tea that afternoon in the parlor, allowing the facts to settle around her like dust disturbed by a breeze. A man returns after years, bearing a key. A woman is seen outside the house the night after his death. Gloves, scarf, concealment. And then there was Charles Carraway himself, tight-lipped, evasive, and with something unreadable in his eyes. Not fear exactly, but a kind of weary dread. A man who had waited too long to confront a truth he hoped had faded with time. Just as Miss Marple was considering her next move, there came a firm knock on the front door. Her housekeeper let in Inspector Cray, whose face was as unreadable as ever, but who walked with the clipped gait of someone in possession of new knowledge. "I've got something," he said, declining tea for once. "You were right about the locksmith. The locks were changed in 42, just after Lydia Carraway left for her sisters in Eastbourne. But get this, they were changed again 3 years later. Quietly. No record of payment through the usual solicitor channels. The locksmith, old Mr. Peel, says it was a special request. Paid in cash. Anonymous client. And the key the deceased carried?" asked Miss Marple. "Matches the second change," said Cray grimly. Whoever gave him that key, or was him, was privy to something private. Very private. I asked Peel about duplicates. He said he made only 2 copies. One for the house and a spare as requested. He's certain. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And Charles claims never to have changed the locks himself? He claims ignorance of any second change at all. Says he assumed the first one, done by his mother, was the only one. Which suggests, Miss Marple said softly, that someone else had access. Perhaps someone Mrs. Carraway trusted, or someone who had cause to return in secret. Cray frowned. Do you think Lydia had a reason to hide someone's access to the house? Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She stood and crossed to the small writing desk, drawing out an envelope that had been delivered with her morning post. It had no return address, but the handwriting was precise, almost clinical. Inside, there was a newspaper clipping, an obituary from a Leeds paper. "Andrew J. Royston," she read aloud, "died suddenly, survived by no family." Cray took it from her. "Where did this come from?" No idea, Miss Marple said. It was left with the post, but I suspect someone wants us to know that the man who died on Charles Carraway's doorstep had a name. Mr. Royston. And no family. Perhaps none willing to claim him, she said, or none who knew. As Cray left, vowing to make inquiries in Leeds, Miss Marple returned to her seat and looked again at the obituary. No age was given, no mention of service records or previous employment. Just a date, a name, and a silence thick enough to invite questions. Later that evening, a note was slipped through her letterbox. Cream paper, no signature. The woman you're looking for once wore pearls to a funeral where no one cried. Ask Charles why he never visited the hospital in January. 1943, Miss Marple folded the note and held it gently between her fingers. The air in the cottage felt cooler suddenly, as though someone had passed through it. Something old, something buried, was clawing its way back to the surface. And Miss Marple, with her quiet eyes and weathered lace cuffs, knew that the true story was only just beginning to reveal itself. The note's cryptic message lingered in Miss Marple's mind as she prepared her modest supper, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables a counterpoint to the swirl of thoughts. Pearls at a funeral where no one cried. A hospital visit in January 1943 never made. Those words seemed deliberately chosen, like a piece of an old puzzle laid out anew, an invitation to peer beneath a layer of polished propriety. Early the next morning, Miss Marple decided to pay a quiet call on Charles Carraway. The rain had returned, a steady drizzle blotting the village's edges in mist, and as she walked the familiar path to Long Brooms, the wet earth gave off its characteristic scent of moss and decay. The chain still hung across the gate, but the lock looked less formidable than the day before, as if the owner were inviting inquiry, or at least resigned to it. Charles answered the door himself. He appeared thinner than she remembered, his dark hair more streaked with grey, eyes wary but polite. "Miss Marple," he said cautiously, "I was wondering if you'd come. I hope you understand. I'm a man with no answers, only questions." She smiled gently. That is often where all our stories begin. "May I come in?" He stepped aside, and she entered the house, now filled with the musty scent of neglect and the faint trace of the florist's lilies still fading from the previous week's arrangements. In the sitting room, the walls bore pictures of a happier past. A young boy in sailor's suit, a proud woman holding a bouquet, and a stern man in uniform. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the fireplace mantel, where a single strand of pearls rested on a velvet cushion, glinting in the grey light. "You keep your mother's pearls here," Miss Marple observed softly. Charles nodded. "Yes. She was quite proud of them, though she never wore them much after everything happened." "May I ask what happened, Charles?" "The note I received mentioned a funeral and pearls, and a hospital visit you never made." His face tightened, a flicker of something like shame passing through his features. "My father died suddenly in January 1943, he said after a moment. "There was a car accident, though some say it was more than that. My mother was too ill at the time to attend his funeral in person. I was supposed to be there, but I never went." "Why?" Charles hesitated, then exhaled. "She didn't want me to. Said it would be too painful. She wanted to keep the family together, no matter the cost. But the truth is, I never quite forgave her." "And this woman in Leeds, the one who arranged flowers at the fundraiser, do you know her?" "Yes, Helena Vaughan," Charles said, his voice low. "She was my mother's friend at one point, though I suspect the friendship ended long before I returned here. I believe she knew more about my family than I ever did." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "And the visitor who died on your doorstep, Andrew Royston, do you know him?" He shook his head, but the flicker of a sigh betrayed his uncertainty. "Number, but I've seen his face in my dreams. It's a face I feel I should remember but cannot." They spoke late into the morning, and as the rain eased, Miss Marple took her leave with more questions than answers. On the way back to Rose Cottage, she resolved to visit the hospital records office in nearby Tring. If Charles had refused to visit, someone must have been admitted there in 1943 whose presence might explain much. The hospital was a grim brick building of post-war austerity, but the archivist was obliging. After some searching, Miss Marple was handed a patient record from January 1943. The name was withheld but marked as confidential. The admission reason, trauma from an accident with complications. The details were scant, but a name in the margin caught Miss Marple's eye. Lydia Carraway. She was admitted as a relative, a visitor recorded in the patient log. "That is odd," Miss Marple murmured. "If Lydia was here, but Charles says she was too ill to attend the funeral, was there more to her absence?" Returning to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found the village abuzz with new rumors. Mrs. Tilling had overheard that the vicar's wife, Mrs. Pargeter, was seen in company with a solicitor late the previous evening. Some whispered of secret wills, others of hidden inheritances. Miss Marple, however, was drawn back to the local churchyard, where she paused beside a grave marked only with a weathered stone bearing the name Elizabeth Pritchard and the date 1942. A folded piece of paper lay beneath a small bouquet of wildflowers. She unfolded the note, written in a careful hand. "Not all wounds heal with time. Seek the one who never left." The phrase stirred something in her mind. Who was the one who never left? Was it Charles, holding on to the past, or someone else? That evening, over tea, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the villagers' faces. Charles's haunted gaze, Mrs. Hartnell's sharp tongue masking deep resentment, and even the quiet vicar, whose prayers seemed to carry more weight than he let on. The following day, as she walked past the bakery, she heard a familiar voice. Inspector Cray, deep in conversation with the baker, Mr. Simmons. "Heard anything from Leeds?" she asked, joining them. Cray nodded. "A little. Andrew Royston was a clerk for a shipping firm. Nothing remarkable except a sudden resignation 2 years ago. He disappeared, as if he'd vanished off the face of the earth." "Any family?" Miss Marple asked. "None that could be traced. No close relatives. But there was a woman associated with him, Helena Vaughan, the florist. She spoke cautiously, didn't want to get involved." Miss Marple smiled thinly. Sometimes caution tells us more than words. The strands of the mystery were slowly weaving into a tapestry, though its pattern remained obscure. A man who died unexpectedly, a family fractured by secrets and silences, a woman watching in the shadows, and a chain of small acts concealing great betrayals. Miss Marple, with her gentle wisdom, knew the key to unraveling this lay not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, overlooked moments. The half-spoken words, the gestures betrayed by eyes, the truths hidden in plain sight. And she intended to watch them all carefully as the village of Saint-Hervin held its breath, waiting for the next whisper to break the silence. The morning after her conversation with Inspector Cray, Miss Marple awoke to a delicate light filtering through the curtains. Yet the chill in the air spoke of an impending autumn. As she brewed her tea and arranged a plate of scones, her mind drifted back to the weathered stone in the churchyard, the note beneath the wildflowers whispering enigmas she could not yet decode. The phrase, "Seek the one who never left," had lodged in her thoughts like a splinter. Her first call of the day was to the vicar, Reverend Jonathan Pargeter, a man whose quiet dignity and measured tone had always impressed Miss Marple. She found him in his study, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and faint traces of lavender. He welcomed her with gentle surprise. "Miss Marple, how may I assist you today? I wondered if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity," she began, choosing her words carefully, about Elizabeth Pritchard. "I noticed her grave in the churchyard is unadorned, yet recently visited." The vicar's face grew somber. Elizabeth was a dear parishioner who died rather suddenly the year before the war's end. A quiet woman, but with a past she never spoke of. Did she have any family in the village? No immediate relatives, I'm afraid. She was, for many years, the housekeeper at Long Brooms before Lydia Carraway returned. After Mrs. Carraway's departure, Elizabeth remained here, steadfast and loyal. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Steadfast and loyal, she repeated, sensing the significance. I have heard that some wounds remain, open long after others believe them healed. Reverend Pargeter inclined his head. Indeed, Miss Marple, if you do pursue this, I urge caution. The shadows that linger in St. Ervan are deeper than one might think. The gentle warning only steeled her resolve. Later, while strolling through the village square, Miss Marple's path crossed with Mrs. Hartnell, whose sharp tongue was softened only slightly by her evident fascination with the unfolding events. You're poking about where you shouldn't, Miss Marple, she warned, glancing furtively around. This business with the Carraways is stirring up more than dust. Sometimes, Mrs. Hartnell, it is the dust that reveals what's been hidden. The woman snorted but said no more, turning on her heel. In the quiet of Rose Cottage that afternoon, Miss Marple spread out her notes. The obituary, the hospital record, the mysterious note, and the fragments gleaned from conversations. Something persistent tugged at her. The absence of Lydia Carraway's name from official family histories, the discrepancy between Charles's memories and the evidence, and the enigma of Andrew Royston's sudden reappearance in their lives. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Standing outside was Helena Vaughan, the florist, her eyes sharp and direct. I thought I might find you here, Helena said without preamble. There are things you don't know, things I can't say in town. Inviting her in, Miss Marple watched as Helena settled into the worn armchair, folding her gloved hands tightly. Why did you come, Helena? She hesitated before speaking. Because I fear what might happen if the truth remains buried. Andrew Royston was not just a stranger. He was part of a promise made long ago, one that my mother and Lydia Carraway shared. Promise, Miss Marple encouraged gently. Helena nodded. A promise to protect a secret that could destroy the Carraways and perhaps others. What kind of secret? Helena's eyes darkened. During the war, there were things done, things best forgotten. But some never forget. Andrew carried a key, not just to a door, but to a truth someone wanted to keep locked away. Miss Marple leaned forward, her fingers steepled. And this secret, does it involve the woman seen outside Long Brooms? The one wearing gloves and a scarf? Helena swallowed hard. Yes, that was my mother. She returned to make sure the past stayed silent. But with Andrew's death, that silence is breaking. Before Miss Marple could ask more, a sharp rap at the window startled them both. Outside stood Charles Carraway, his face pale but resolute. I need to speak with you all, he said, voice steady despite the tension. As they gathered in the parlor, Charles revealed a letter he had recently discovered, hidden among his mother's belongings. It was addressed to Lydia, written in a firm but affectionate hand. My dear Lydia, it began, the arrangements we discussed must remain our secret. For the sake of the family and those we love, you must guard the key and the truth it opens. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the letterhead. Royston and Company, shipping agents, Leeds. The circle of silent understanding tightened. Andrew Royston had not only been a man of mystery, but the keeper of a pact sealed with silence and fear. The room fell into a thoughtful hush. Miss Marple's mind raced through the implications. A family pact, a hidden inheritance or scandal, perhaps a wartime betrayal. Each possibility brought new motives, new shadows. Charles broke the silence. I fear the woman who came back, the one Helena identified, was trying to protect us all. But in doing so, she may have set events in motion no one foresaw. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Protection can often become a cage, and sometimes the key to freedom is the very thing that locks us in. As dusk settled over St. Irvyne, the village seemed to hold its breath, caught between the past's quiet wait and the uncertain dawn of revelations yet to come. And Miss Marple, ever patient and keen, knew that the next steps would require not only observation but a delicate touch, the kind that could unravel even the most tightly knotted secrets. The morning after Helena Vaughan's visit, a thick mist clung to the village of St. Irvyne, softening the outlines of hedgerows and rooftops alike. Miss Marple found herself drawn once more to long brooms, compelled to walk the gravel path that led to the imposing house, now draped in shadows and silence. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of damp earth and fading chrysanthemums from the neglected garden beds. Charles Carroway greeted her at the gate, his expression more guarded than before. There was something resolute beneath his fatigue, a determination not yet extinguished by grief or suspicion. "Miss Marple," he said, "I'm beginning to understand the depth of the trouble we're in. This secret, it's like a heavy fog that won't lift." She smiled kindly. "Sometimes the fog is thickest just before dawn, Charles. We must be patient and watchful." Inside the drawing room, Charles showed her a worn leather box he had found among his father's belongings. It was locked, but the key was in the lock itself. An odd gesture, as if inviting discovery. Inside were several letters and a bundle of faded photographs, each bearing a story whispered in sepia tones. One photograph caught Miss Marple's eye. A group of men and women standing before a modest cottage, their faces smiling but tense. At the center stood Lydia Carroway, her expression firm yet wistful. On the back, a hastily scrawled date. May 1942, the pact. "This," Charles explained, "was taken just before my mother left for Leeds." She never spoke of this meeting, but I suspect it was the beginning of the promise Helena mentioned. Miss Marple examined the letters carefully. They spoke in careful, coded language about safeguarding something, an item, a truth, a legacy that must never fall into the wrong hands. There was a mention of a Mr. Royston as the custodian, and a guardian's duty passed from one to the next. As they spoke, the sound of a car crunching along the drive interrupted their reverie. Inspector Cray stepped into the room, a file in hand and a look of quiet resolve. "Miss Marple, Mr. Carroway," he began, "we've uncovered something new at the post office. A package addressed to Andrew Royston, sent just a week before his death. Returned unclaimed." Charles's eyes narrowed. "What was inside?" Cray hesitated, then unfolded a sheet of heavy parchment, its edges worn and sealed with a faded red wax crest. "A map," Cray said, "marked with a location just outside St. Irvyne, near the old chapel ruins on Bleakmore Hill." Miss Marple felt the threads tighten around her heart. The chapel ruins, an ancient site long abandoned, whispered among villagers as a place of secrets and sorrow. "That place," she murmured, "has seen more than its share of silent prayers." The three agreed to visit the ruins that afternoon. The path to Bleakmore Hill wound through bracken and gorse, the sky a leaden canvas above. As they approached, the chapel's stone skeleton emerged from the mist, its broken arches and shattered windows resembling a forgotten relic from a bygone era. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something glinting amid the rubble, a small metal clasp engraved with the same crest as the wax seal on the map. She knelt and picked it up carefully. "The past and present are bound tighter than we think," she said softly. As they explored, Charles uncovered a shallow grave beneath a collapsed wall disturbed recently. Inspector Cray called for a medical team, and the village was soon abuzz with hushed speculation. Back in St. Irvyne, Miss Marple pondered the implications. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide or reveal something here. And the arrival of Andrew Royston at Long Brooms was no accident. The pact, The promise, the returned package, it all pointed to a secret that someone desperately wanted to protect or bury. That evening, over tea at the vicarage, Miss Marple confided in Reverend Pargeter. The vicar listened intently, his brow furrowed. "The chapel ruins have long been a place of legend," he said, "but I wonder if the legends hold more truth than we ever dared imagine." The following days brought further revelations. Mrs. Hartnell admitted to overhearing a heated argument near the village green between Helena Vaughan and a stranger, tall, dark-haired, and speaking with an unfamiliar accent. The stranger had insisted on retrieving a key and warned Helena to stay silent. Miss Marple sensed the pieces shifting again. The stranger's presence suggested the circle of secrets extended beyond St. Hervan, reaching into old rivalries and debts. Then came a letter addressed to Miss Marple herself, penned in a precise but unfamiliar hand. It contained only these words: "The truth is neither safe nor simple. Beware those who wear masks." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it carefully. It was a challenge and a warning wrapped in civility. The village, once peaceful, now seemed caught in a delicate dance of shadows. The boundaries between friend and foe blurred, and the past's long reach threatened to pull them all under. Yet amid the uncertainty, Miss Marple's quiet resolve did not waver. She understood that human nature was a complex web of loyalties and betrayals, fears and hopes, and only by unraveling those tangled threads with patience and subtlety could justice be found. As dusk fell, she sat by the window, gazing out at the flickering lamplight along the village street. Somewhere in the shadows, the truth waited, patient, elusive, and dangerous, and she was ready to find it. The arrival of the anonymous letter left Miss Marple with an unsettling sense of both caution and clarity. The words echoed in her mind: "Beware those who wear masks." It was a cryptic admonition, yet in a village like Saint-Hervan, where facades were carefully maintained and secrets layered beneath polite smiles, such a warning carried weight. That very morning, the village stirred with whispers. News of the grave unearthed at the chapel, ruins had spread, prompting hushed speculation about what or whom might lie beneath the disturbed soil. Inspector Cray, now more intent than ever, had widened his inquiries, interviewing every villager who might shed light on the mysterious stranger Helena had mentioned, or the returned parcel that had sparked this chain of events. Miss Marple, however, chose a different approach. She was acutely aware that, in small communities, truth often hid not in plain sight, but beneath the subtlest behaviors, the slightest deviations from routine. Her first stop was the village shop, a place of perpetual gossip and veiled exchanges. Mrs. Hartnell was behind the counter, eyeing her with an uncharacteristic wariness. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said briskly. "People are talking, you know. They say that stranger Helena mentioned has been seen again at the edge of the woods near the old mill." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Has anyone seen who he is?" "No, but some say he's not from these parts. Strange accent, always watching, never speaking to anyone but Helena." Miss Marple folded her shopping list and smiled gently. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartnell. You've been very helpful." Outside, the autumn sun had pierced the mist, casting a golden hue over the cobblestones. Miss Marple made her way toward the mill, a weathered structure long out of use, its timbers groaning softly in the breeze. It was the sort of place where shadows gathered, not only those cast by crumbling walls, but those woven from history and hidden intentions. As she approached, she noticed footprints pressed into the soft earth, recent, unmistakably human, leading into the nearby woods. With measured steps, she followed the trail until she came upon a figure crouched beside the gnarled roots of an ancient oak, Helena Vaughan. Helena looked up, startled but not frightened. "Miss Marple," she breathed, "I didn't expect to see anyone here. Nor did I expect you to be digging near the old mill." Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but probing. "What are you looking for?" Helena hesitated, her fingers trembling as she brushed aside layers of fallen leaves. "A locket," she admitted. "It belonged to my mother. She said it was the last piece of the puzzle." Miss Marple crouched beside her, peering at the disturbed soil. "And what puzzle might that be?" Helena's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "The truth about what happened during the war. The promise, the pact, and the man who died protecting it. My mother kept the locket hidden, believing it could reveal what some wanted to keep buried forever. Together, they unearthed a small, tarnished silver locket, its delicate clasp still intact. Inside was a faded photograph of Lydia Carroway and Andrew Royston, smiling in a moment of rare happiness. On the reverse, a cipher etched faintly into the metal caught Miss Marple's eye. "It's a code," she murmured, tracing the pattern with her fingertip. "Not just a keepsake, but a key." Helena nodded, her breath hitching. "My mother told me the code could unlock a safe place where secrets were stored." Before they could delve further, footsteps approached swiftly. It was Charles Carroway, his face drawn with concern. "You found it," he said, relief mingling with urgency. "This changes everything." Miss Marple observed the exchange carefully, noting the subtle tension threading through their voices. The locket was no mere trinket. It was a tangible link to the past's labyrinth. Later that afternoon, back at Rose Cottage, Miss Marple began to study the cipher. It was a series of dots and dashes, reminiscent of Morse code, but with slight variations that suggested a personal touch. A modified message meant only for those who knew its secret. Charles arrived with a letter he had found tucked inside an old book belonging to his mother. It was addressed to Andrew Royston and spoke cryptically of the ledger and the burden of truth, urging caution and discretion. "The ledger?" Miss Marple echoed. "Do you know what it might be?" Charles shook his head. "No, but if the locket's code can unlock it, then perhaps it's the final piece of the puzzle." Miss Marple agreed to accompany Charles to the village archives the next day. The archives were housed in the old town hall, a place where dusty documents and forgotten records waited patiently for rediscovery. As they sifted through crates and ledgers, a worn, leather-bound book surfaced, its cover embossed with the Royston family crest. Inside were meticulous records of shipping transactions, but also something far more significant, a handwritten ledger listing names, dates, and payments, some marked with cryptic symbols. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "This ledger holds more than commerce, Charles. It may reveal the hidden debts and favors that underpin this entire mystery." Just then, a soft knock startled them. It was Inspector Cray, who had come to review his own findings. His expression was grim. "We've identified the stranger," he said quietly. "His name is Victor Lang, a former intelligence officer from Europe, now working as a private investigator. He's been shadowing the village since Andrew Royston's arrival." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Charles and Helena, their silent questions hanging in the air. "What is his interest here?" Charles demanded. Cray hesitated. "That's what we need to find out. But I suspect it has something to do with the ledger and the secrets it protects." As evening deepened, the village of St. Hervens seemed to pulse with anticipation, the old stones and winding lanes bearing witness to a tale of loyalty, betrayal, and long-buried truths. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the fire, felt the threads of the mystery tighten around her like a web. The pact, the promise, the mysterious deaths, all pointed toward a carefully concealed conspiracy. Yet amidst the shadows, she detected faint glimmers of hope, a chance to bring light to the darkness, not by force, but through the delicate unraveling of human nature. Tomorrow, she knew, would demand patience and subtlety, for the masks worn by friend and foe alike were not easily lifted. But Miss Marple was ready. The morning mist hung low over St. Hervens, lending the village an ethereal stillness that belied the turmoil simmering beneath its surface. Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table in Rose Cottage, the ledger open before her, its yellowed pages heavy with secrets. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, her keen eyes tracing the faint symbols and coded notes that accompanied the names and transactions. Each entry hinted at relationships and obligations far more complex than mere business dealings. Charles Carraway paced the room restlessly. "It's clear now," he said, voice low and tense. "This ledger is a record of clandestine arrangements, payments, favors, perhaps even bribes, made during the war years and since. It implicates several families in the village, including my own." Helena stood by the window, fingers clasped tightly. But why would Andrew Royston be so concerned with it? And why would someone go to such lengths to retrieve or destroy it? Miss Marple glanced up, eyes sharp. "Because, my dear, this ledger holds the truth, and the truth has a habit of upsetting those who profit from silence." Before the conversation could deepen, there came a soft knock at the door. Inspector Cray entered, his expression guarded, but respectful. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've been reviewing the movements of Victor Lang. It seems he's been contacting several villagers under the guise of casual inquiry, but his questions suggest he's after something very specific. The ledger, perhaps." Miss Marple nodded. "It's imperative we understand who might want to keep those secrets buried and why." Cray's brow furrowed. "There's more. We found Helena's name mentioned in some correspondence between Lang and an unknown party. It seems she may be more involved than she has admitted." Charles stiffened. "Helena. But she's been nothing but cooperative." Miss Marple raised a hand to calm him. "People's loyalties are often divided, especially when the past is tangled with pain and fear. Helena may hold keys we do not yet grasp." The day unfolded with a series of careful interviews. Miss Marple accompanied Inspector Cray to the homes of the villagers whose names appeared in the ledger, listening not only to their words, but observing their mannerisms, the nervous glances, the forced smiles, the too quick changes of subject. Each subtle sign was a thread to be pulled. At the parsonage, Reverend Howard received them with a courteous but tight smile. "The past is best left alone," he said quietly, when shown the ledger's entries. "Some things are too dangerous to be unearthed." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Dangerous indeed, Reverend, but sometimes the only way to heal is through truth." Later, in the village pub, the atmosphere was thick with speculation. Villagers spoke in hushed tones, their faces shadowed by worry. Miss Marple caught snippets of conversations, accusations veiled as jokes, old grievances resurfacing like unwelcome ghosts. Returning to Rose Cottage that evening, Miss Marple found Helena waiting, a mixture of resolve and apprehension in her gaze. "There's something I must confess," Helena said. "I sought out Victor Lang because I believed he might help me find the truth about my family, but I fear he has his own agenda." Miss Marple regarded her steadily. "And what is that agenda?" Helena hesitated, then whispered, "Power. Revenge. The ledger contains names that could destroy reputations and fortunes. Victor wants to control that power." Miss Marple's mind pieced together the puzzle, each element aligned like a mosaic, revealing a grim picture of greed and betrayal. That night, Miss Marple set a subtle trap. She arranged for a discreet gathering at the village hall under the pretense of discussing the village's future, a topic certain to draw those with vested interests. There, she would observe who sought to steer conversation away from the ledger and who lingered too long in silence. As the villagers gathered, polite conversation masked the undercurrents of tension. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, noting the slight stiffness in Charles Carraway's posture, the flicker of unease in the Reverend's eyes, and the barely concealed impatience of a local landowner whose name appeared frequently in the ledger. Victor Lang arrived later than expected, slipping into the hall with practiced ease. His presence commanded attention, and yet he remained an enigma, a stranger threading through the village's fragile social fabric. Miss Marple approached him quietly. "Mr. Lang," she said, voice light yet firm, "what is it you hope to find in St. Ervon?" Lang's smile was thin, almost predatory. "Answers, Mrs. Marple, and perhaps a resolution long overdue." Her eyes narrowed slightly. Resolution built on secrets is rarely peaceful. Throughout the evening, Miss Marple watched the interplay of glances and half-spoken words. The ledger's shadow hung over them all, a reminder that beneath the village's calm surface churned a maelstrom of hidden motives. When the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple knew the coming days would be crucial. The masks were beginning to slip, but the full truth remained elusive. She would need all her patience and insight to unravel the final strands, and to catch the stranger who had knocked at his own door before he vanished again into the shadows. The morning after the village hall gathering dawned grey and chilly, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to wash the streets, but could not cleanse the unease lingering over St. Ervan. Miss Marple rose early, moving quietly about Rose Cottage as the faint light seeped through lace curtains. She felt the weight of the unfolding mystery settle more heavily now, as if the threads she had so patiently gathered were twisting into a tighter noose. Helena was already at the kitchen table when Miss Marple joined her, the ledger spread out once more before her. Her eyes were tired but resolute. "I can't shake the feeling that Victor Lang is playing a deeper game," she said softly. "He's not just after the ledger. He wants to manipulate those who hold power here." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Power, indeed, is a tempting prize. But what frightens me more is the desperation beneath it. People who cling to secrets for fear of losing everything. Before Helena could respond, there was a knock at the door. Miss Marple opened it to find Inspector Cray standing there, his usually composed expression marked with concern. "We need to speak," he said. "Something has come to light overnight." Inside, Cray unfolded a small sheaf of papers. "Our post-mortem on Andrew Royston revealed traces of a rare poison, one not readily available. That changes things. This was no spur-of-the-moment act." Helena's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her tea, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of fear in her eyes. "This poison," Cray continued, "is known to be used in certain circles, those with medical knowledge or access. We have to consider that the murderer planned this carefully and had knowledge of Andrew's routines." Miss Marple's mind raced back to the quiet patterns she had observed, the subtle avoidance of certain questions, the barely concealed anxieties. "And yet," she said softly, "none of those who knew Andrew intimately would wish him harm, at least not openly. The poison points to someone who wished to avoid direct confrontation, to mask their hand." Cray frowned. "We're investigating who might have had access. But there's more. A witness came forward early this morning, a farmhand named Thomas Briggs. He says he saw a figure near the old mill late last night, someone who wasn't known in the village." Helena's breath caught. "Could it have been Victor?" "That's what we suspect. Briggs describes a man tall, with a dark coat, moving swiftly, like someone who didn't want to be noticed." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "The mill is significant. It was Andrew's father's old property, long abandoned but often visited by those with a past to hide." "We're sending a team to investigate," Cray said, "but I thought you should know first. Your insight might guide us." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Thank you, Inspector. I believe the answers lie not just in places, but in the hearts of those who tread them." As the inspector left, Helena looked up, eyes wide. "Do you think Victor is the murderer?" Miss Marple paused, her expression unreadable. "He is certainly involved, but the question remains, who else is willing to kill to keep the ledger's secrets?" Later that afternoon, Miss Marple and Helena walked toward the village green, the drizzle having ceased but leaving the cobblestones slick and reflective. Villagers passed by with guarded expressions, whispers following their footsteps. The social fabric of Saint-Hervan was fraying visibly. At the small general store, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Pennyweather, the postmistress, who seemed unusually flustered. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, "have you heard? There's been talk that someone's been sending threatening letters to Charles Carraway. He's been quite upset, locked himself away for much of the morning." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. "Threatening letters? That is certainly worth noting. Do you know who might have sent them?" Mrs. Pennyweather shook her head. "No idea, but the handwriting was strange, like it was meant to be disguised." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Disguised handwriting and poison suggest a killer who fears discovery but is desperate to act. As they continued their walk, Helena confided in Miss Marple. "Charles is so proud, so determined to clear his family's name. But I fear he's blinded by loyalty. He's too quick to dismiss that the past might hold darker truths." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Loyalty is a powerful lens, dear. It can shield us from seeing what is right before our eyes." Their path took them past the old mill. The building loomed in the gathering twilight, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring out across the fields. Miss Marple's gaze lingered there. "Perhaps it's time we pay a visit," she said softly. That evening, under the guise of wanting to clear her thoughts, Miss Marple ventured toward the mill alone. The air was thick with dampness and the faint scent of earth and decay. She moved carefully, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoing in the quiet. Near the entrance, a scrap of fabric caught her eye, dark and coarse, caught on a nail protruding from the broken door frame. She bent to examine it closely. The weave was fine, not typical of a laborer's worn clothing, but something more deliberate, more guarded. A sound behind her made her turn sharply, a shadow slipping into the gloom. But it was only Helena, her face pale but determined. "I thought you might come," Helena whispered. "There's something here. I saw it before, but was afraid to say." Together they stepped inside. The mill's interior was a cavern of shadows and forgotten machinery. Miss Marple's eyes caught a faint smear on the floor, a reddish stain, dried but unmistakably blood. Helena gasped. "This changes everything. Someone was hurt here recently." Miss Marple knelt beside the stain, fingertips tracing the outline. Yes, and if Andrew Royston was poisoned, perhaps the mill was the meeting place where threats were exchanged, or worse, where his killer planned the deed. The two women exchanged a glance heavy with unspoken questions. As they exited the mill, the distant sound of footsteps made them freeze. From the shadows emerged Charles Carraway, face ashen. "I was coming to check here," he said breathlessly. I didn't want you to find out this way." Miss Marple studied him closely. "What is it, Charles?" He hesitated, then spoke, voice breaking slightly. "There's more in that ledger than I realized. Names, yes, but also threats, debts, old betrayals. My family's past is darker than I thought, and someone is desperate enough to kill to keep it hidden." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was alert. "You are caught in a web, Charles, but do not despair. The truth is like a thread. If you follow it carefully, it will lead you out." He nodded slowly, the weight of the evening settling on his shoulders. "I want to help. I want to see this right." Helena placed a steadying hand on his arm. "We'll get there, together." As they walked back toward the village, the shadows deepened and Miss Marple's mind raced ahead, piecing together the final clues. The stranger who knocked at his own door was no longer just a visitor to Saint Hervan. He was a catalyst, unraveling the fabric of a community that had long pretended to be whole. And somewhere in that unraveling lay the secret that would finally reveal the killer. The days that followed in Saint-Hervan were cloaked in a peculiar stillness, as if the village itself held its breath, awaiting the resolution to a puzzle whose pieces refused to settle. Miss Marple sensed that the fragile veil over the community's secrets was about to lift, and with it, the true nature of the stranger who had knocked at his own door. Charles Carroway, now visibly burdened but resolute, worked closely with Inspector Cray and Miss Marple, determined to face the shadows in his family's history. Helena remained a steadfast companion, offering support both practical and emotional. Together, the three women and one man formed a quiet alliance in a village that had grown wary of every glance and whispered word. Miss Marple spent her mornings at Rose Cottage reflecting on the revelations and piecing together the fragments of the ledger with renewed focus. The ledger was more than a list of names. It was a tapestry of old grievances, debts, and veiled threats. One entry, in particular, had caught her eye, the name of a woman who had vanished from St. Irvan decades ago under mysterious circumstances. The ledger mentioned her briefly, with a cryptic note beside it. Disappeared after crossing the Carroways. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to that vanished figure, wondering if her story was intertwined with the current turmoil. The past, she knew, had a stubborn way of reaching into the present. Late one afternoon, Charles invited Miss Marple and Helena to the Carroway estate for a quiet meeting. The large manor stood solemnly at the edge of the village, its stone walls bearing the weight of generations. Inside, Charles led them to a modest study where a fire crackled gently in the hearth. "I want to show you something," Charles said, pulling a small, worn, leather-bound book from a hidden compartment in his desk. "This belonged to my grandfather. It's his diary." Miss Marple took the book delicately, noting the faded ink and careful script. "May I?" she asked, flipping open the cover. The diary revealed a side of the Carroway family that had never been spoken aloud. The greed, the betrayals, and, most troublingly, hints of blackmail and menace directed at villagers who had crossed their path. There were entries about a woman named Evelyn Marston, whose disappearance had been officially recorded as a tragic accident, though the diary hinted otherwise. Helena's voice trembled as she read a passage aloud. "The ledger holds power beyond money. It holds the truth that must never see the light. Evelyn's silence is the price of peace." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Peace maintained by silence is often built on fear." Charles looked up, his expression troubled. "I had no idea. I thought our family's mistakes were mere business missteps. This is something darker." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Cray, his face grave. "There's been an incident at the mill." Together they hurried outside to find a small crowd gathered near the edge of the property. A local farmer had discovered another body. This one, a woman. The victim's features were unfamiliar to most, but Helena's face went pale. "It's Evelyn Marston," she whispered. Miss Marple knelt beside the body, noting the serene expression that belied the violence of her death. There were no obvious wounds, only the faint scent of the same rare poison found in Andrew Royston's system. "Poison again," Miss Marple murmured. "The killer is sending a message, or covering their tracks with meticulous care." Inspector Cray began organizing the scene, while Charles and Helena stood close, their shared grief palpable. As night fell, Miss Marple retreated to the village library, where she sought the village records and newspaper archives. Evelyn's disappearance had been a source of hushed speculation for years, but no definitive answers. The few articles hinted at scandal involving the Carroway family and a bitter dispute over land and inheritance. It was then that Miss Marple noticed a pattern. The poison used in both deaths was traced back to a rare plant, wolfsbane, cultivated in only a few private gardens in the area. One such garden belonged to Lady Agnes Mallory, a distant relative of the Carroways and known for her eccentricities and extensive botanical knowledge. Miss Marple decided it was time for a visit. The Mallory estate was a short walk from the village center, its iron gates ornate and imposing. Lady Agnes, An elderly woman with sharp eyes and a quick wit greeted her warmly, but with a flicker of caution. Over tea in the sunroom, Miss Marple broached the subject gently. "Lady Agnes, I understand you have an interest in rare plants, including wolfsbane." The lady's gaze hardened slightly. "Wolfsbane is a dangerous plant, Miss Marple. Beautiful, but deadly. I keep it for study, nothing more." Miss Marple pressed on. "Would it surprise you to know that wolfsbane was the cause of recent deaths in St. Irvan?" Lady Agnes's hands trembled for just a moment before she regained composure. "I have no reason to harm anyone," she said firmly, "but I know many in this village have secrets they guard fiercely." The conversation lingered in Miss Marple's mind as she left. Lady Agnes's reaction was too controlled to be innocent. There was something lurking beneath her composed exterior, something carefully hidden. Back in the village, Miss Marple arranged a discreet meeting with Charles and Helena. "The poison source is likely closer than we thought," she said. "Lady Agnes's possession of wolfsbane, her connection to the Caraway family, and the history of the ledger, it all points to a deeper conspiracy." Helena sighed, her eyes tired. "But why continue this cycle of murder now? What is the killer trying to achieve?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. To protect a legacy. To silence those who threaten it. And perhaps to punish the sins of the past through the present. Inspector Cray arrived with news that another letter had been found. This one slipped under the door of the village post office, addressed to Charles. The note was brief, threatening, and unsigned. "The ledger's truth will bury you all." Fear rippled through the village like a sudden storm, but Miss Marple remained calm. Fear makes people hasty, and hasty people make mistakes. The next day, Miss Marple invited the principal villagers to a quiet gathering at the church, a neutral ground where tensions could be diffused and truths might surface. As the small group assembled, each face revealed layers of anxiety and resolve. Without fanfare, Miss Marple began to speak, her voice gentle but firm. She recounted the known facts, the poison, the ledger, the deaths, and the ties that bound them. She spoke not as an accuser, but as one seeking understanding. Slowly, stories began to emerge. Tales of old betrayals, forbidden romances, and bitter disputes that had long been buried beneath polite smiles and village customs. The gathering revealed that many had reason to fear the ledger's exposure, but none confessed to the violence. Yet, in the quiet moments, Miss Marple noted subtle glances and nervous twitches. The truth was near, hidden in plain sight. As the afternoon light waned, a sudden crash echoed through the churchyard. The group rushed outside to find a broken window and a hastily discarded bundle. Inside, more pages from the ledger, torn and soaked in rain. The attack was a clear warning, but also a mistake. It exposed desperation, and with it, Miss Marple's resolve hardened. "The game is nearly over," she murmured to Helena. "Now we wait for the final move." In the stillness that followed, the village of St. Irvan seemed suspended, every resident holding their breath as Miss Marple prepared to reveal the truth that would shatter the fragile peace forever. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green as the gathered villagers assembled once more at the churchyard, the very heart of Saint. Irvan's uneasy calm. The broken window, the soaked pages of the ledger, and the whispered fears of all present had cast a pall over the village. But for Miss Marple, the time had come. The threads she had quietly gathered over weeks were woven tightly enough to unveil the truth. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the faces. Charles Caraway, his brow furrowed with concern. Helena, steadfast and silent. Lady Agnes Mallory, whose icy composure barely masked a flicker of unease. Inspector Cray, steady and professional. And the others, villagers cloaked in layers of suspicion and whispered secrets. "My friends," Miss Marple began softly, "the past is a most persistent visitor. It lingers in corners we think we have swept clean, and it hides behind the very doors we trust. But it is always there, waiting. She held up the soaked ledger pages. These torn leaves are more than a list of debts and names. They are a mirror, reflecting the weight of choices made long ago. And it was to protect those choices that Evelyn Marston was silenced. Not once, but twice. A breath stirred the crowd. Miss Marple turned her gaze deliberately to Lady Agnes Mallory. Lady Agnes, you possess a rare knowledge of poisons and plants. You also hold ties to the Carraway family, connections that run deeper than social visits and afternoon teas. You feared the ledger's revelations would unearth secrets that might destroy you, didn't you? Lady Agnes's lips pressed into a thin line, but she did not speak. It was you who sent the threatening notes, trying to frighten Charles and anyone else who might pry into the past. You used your knowledge of Wolfsbane to kill Andrew Royston, and again to end Evelyn's second chance at life, hoping to bury her truth forever. The gathered villagers murmured, shocked but unable to deny the weight of the evidence. Miss Marple continued. The ledger's entries speak of land disputes, bitter betrayals, and debts paid with silence and fear. Evelyn discovered something she was not meant to know. When she threatened to expose the Carraways' darkest dealings, you chose to protect the family name by any means necessary. Lady Agnes's shoulders sagged. The facade cracked. Yes, she whispered. I acted to preserve what remained of our family's honor. But I never wished harm beyond what was necessary. Inspector Cray stepped forward, nodding to his men, who moved to take Lady Agnes into custody. Charles looked both relieved and saddened. The weight of generations lifted, but the cost laid bare. Helena reached out, grasping his hand gently. Miss Marple turned to the villagers, her voice gentle but firm. Let this be a lesson, not just in justice, but in the perils of secrets left to fester. The truth may be uncomfortable, but it is the only path to peace. As the crowd dispersed, the village seemed to breathe again, though forever changed. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, reflecting on the fragile human hearts she had seen laid bare. The mystery was solved, but the shadows of the past lingered, a reminder that in every village, every home, there are doors behind which stories wait, waiting for someone patient enough to knock.